Now that we've discussed how a form is built, let's discuss some of the internal components of a form. And the most commonly used form control is something called an input box. And input boxes come in various types, but the most common is a text type. And within this type, there's different things in here. Let's look at this really quick. So I'm going to refresh this, and you can see we have this box here, and we now can type inside that box. And so first off, we'd probably want to put something up front. Maybe we'll have some kind of form people could, sign up to adopt a monkey, right? We could do something like, we'll do an H2 tag, adopt a monkey, or something like that. And we'd want them to fill out a short form for this. So we have an input type equals text, and at this point we're lacking a few things. One, we can't hit submit to send it. We could hit enter, but it may not know what it's doing. So let's do that next. Let's do another input type, and this type is going to be called a submit button, and we'll look at that now. Okay, so that's come down. So if I type out an email at domain.com and hit submit, you can see it went back to the same page because we are using the action hashtag, which goes back to the same page and uses post. Let's show you the difference between post and get. Okay, if you can see up here, it used this hashtag. Let's go down and fill this out again and hit submit, and you'll notice that nothing was put up in the URL except for this hashtag. Well, in order to send the data to a specific spot, we need to tell it how to recognize and identify that. And so the way we do that is through a name. And our name is going to, think of this like a variable, like x equals 5, right? And 5 is what we would type in, and x is the variable name. So let's come up with a name. We could call this one just email, okay? And we'll go refresh it. Here, we'll go down the bottom, and I'll type out that email, and I'll hit submit. And now up here, you can see where we've got this question mark. Email equals email at domain.com, and then hashtag to go to that section of the page. And so that's one of the things we talked about in a previous video, where get can get us in trouble. If you had a social security number, a credit card number, something important, you probably don't want this saved in a person's browser, because you could always go to history and pull that up and look to see what they've been looking at and what information is in there. And so we're going to flip that back to post, and we'll look at it that way. And now when I put in that email, you can see that it's not in the URL anymore, but it is being sent over. But you need to have a processor that can get at that data. So let's move on with different input types here. So we have an input type text, and we have an input type submit. With this one, we have the attribute name equals email, and that just allows us to send that. But there's a whole lot of other attributes we can put in here, and I wanted to go down through a few. So name is probably the most common, and that's required to have a form process. Again, the big ones are have an action, have a method, have a name in your input type, and probably some way to submit it. Okay, autocomplete. And this other name up here and an ID, not as necessary. Nice, but not as necessary. So let's talk about some other attributes with input tags we can use. So size allows us to think of it like the size of characters and how wide you want the box to be. So if I said 3 and we refreshed it, let's go back, you can see how it's really small. Now, I don't really like using this tag because I'd rather use CSS to control how wide that text box ends up being. We can also use max length, and this is going to be how many characters can we put in before it stops us. So I put 3 again. You can see it's much wider, and I hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You see it stopped at 3. So it kind of is a way to, if you had a zip code and you only wanted 5 characters, you could do something like that. You can also use something called value. And let's say you were having a user edit their profile. You might use value to put in their email at domain.com ahead of time. And so in this case, you can see how email@domain.com is already there. And so I could submit that and it would just loop right back around. And so value is a way of putting something in so they don't have to type it. Some of you might think something like email@domain.com would be good, but often people hit submit and not type their own in, and then you get bad data. And so for that, we use something called a placeholder. And placeholder, I want you to look at the difference when I refresh this, how black this is and how we can edit it. And when we click on it, we can highlight it. So I'm going to refresh it now, and we'll go back, and it says email@domain.com, but when I click on it and start typing, it disappears. And so it's just a prompt, and there's not actually hard data there. When you delete it, it comes back, but when you start typing, it's there. And when nothing is there and you hit submit, it doesn't send that piece of data. So it's just a placeholder, nothing more. So placeholders are something I use quite a bit and would recommend. Another attribute we can use is called disabled. And disabled is something we can use to make it so we can't type in it. So I'm clicking and I can't type in there because that form control is disabled at that point. We can do another one that's read only, which allows something to be displayed but can't be edited. Don't really use that one a lot. We can also use the autocomplete. We've talked about equals off, if you want to turn that off or not. Don't use that a ton, but it is nice every now and then. There's also one called required, and this is pretty cool, where I'll come in here and I'll try to hit submit, and if I don't fill that out, it won't allow me to submit my form. So required is a good thing if you want them to do specific actions and fill things out. So let's look at this type submit here. It'd probably be a good name or a good thing to type in a name for it. And what that would actually send, if I would send that to the processor, it would send a variable called submit, and then it would send the word submit that's on the button. And we can change that just by using value, as we've talked about before. So maybe I want to put send on there and refresh it. You can see send. And so now if I was to send that form control, it would say submit equals send is the data being sent across. Now another form control I don't really use a lot, but it does exist out there, is what we call an input type reset. And we can give it a name if we wanted to, and a value, I'm going to put in clear, because if I don't, it will write reset, which is fine. But you can see we have a send and clear, and if I type something out and I hit clear, it clears it or it resets it. Honestly, I don't use these that often, but it's good to know about them in case you ever run into them and want to use them for whatever reason. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is what's called a checkbox. And a checkbox lets us fill out if we want to perform something or do something. Do you want to adopt a monkey? And then we'll put in a checkbox right here. So let's do an input type equals checkbox. Okay, we should give it a name, and we'll just call this one adopt, something like that. And then we can put the value, well, let's call the name, well, we'll just show you here. We'll do an adopt, and then we'll do a value equals yes, like so. And I'm going to put right after it a space yes. And then we'll do another one of these. We'll do that. And then we'll do a no. And let's look at the difference between these, okay? Now adopt yes, adopt no. I'm going to put those as the names, and we'll look at that. Now I'm going to change this back to get, so we can actually look at some of the data up in the URL. Okay, so I'll refresh that again. We have this that's come out. We probably should put a break there, so that goes down a line and looks a little cleaner. And we can put out email@domain.com, and do we want to get a monkey, yes. And we'll hit it. Now up in here you can see that emails come through, and we have the dot y equals yes, and the submit equals send. Remember how I told you if we have that name submit, it's going to send that value. And so if I do check one of those boxes, it sends over the name and the value. And now I could go through in this case and check both. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to be able to check both. I really want to check one or the other. And then a better thing to do this would be using a radio button. And so we just type out radio. Now in order for radio buttons to work, you've got to have the same name. And so I'm going to go back and do an adopt. And the value will either be yes or no in here. And now let's take a look. And you can see we've got these. Now because I'm using the same name, it allows me to check one or the other. If I was to change that name to a different name for each of them, I could check both at the same time. So in order to check one over the other, you kind of have to use the same name, and then we have that functionality that comes from a radio button, which is really handy. Now we can use a lot of these same attributes we've talked about with names and IDs, and one in particular that's native to the radio buttons and checkbox is something called checked. And you know, if I click on no and I refresh the page, you can see it's gone back to yes because I have that checked attribute selected. And so that's kind of nice. We can also use required and disabled and read only and all these other things we've learned, and it makes things a little bit nicer. Now let's say I've got an email address that's receiving tons of forms off of my website, right? And I don't know what page this email is being sent from. Like I don't know what form it's being sent from. And so there's an input type equals hidden. And this is for sending data that you don't want people to see. You know, so we're going to say name equals form type. And we can say something like value equals adopt a monkey. Okay, something like that. And what that's going to do is it's going to send hidden data. I'm going to take off that required because it keeps coming and prompting me for it, and I don't want to have to type it out. Okay, I send it here, and you can see the form type adopt a monkey came through. And so the user is just completely unaware of that, and you can just use it to communicate information that you may not want them to see, right? Another thing you can use from time to time is something called a password type. And we could type out something like this. We could say type in the, maybe we're taking coupon codes for this, right? Promo code. Or maybe, I don't know, let's go with the password. Type in, well, we'll just say password. Okay, I don't know why you want a password to adopt a monkey, but you never know what you need. I'm going to use this kind of as a template here. And we'll put that in. And I'm going to change type into a password type. And I'm going to change email, the name, into password. And again, that can just be our variable that we're using. And I'll refresh that, and you can see now when I type it in, I get like the little password, little dots, and so people can't see it. Now, this isn't totally protected. If you ever want to mess with your friend and you see something like this, you can always just right-click it, go to inspect, pull up the inspector that we've been using on and off over the semester, and then just go over to this part and double-click on it, and you can change it back to a text box, and then it just shows exactly what was in there. So it's not actually totally protected. And I think that brings up a good point, that when we're working on forms, often you want your data to come in very clean, okay? Meaning, if I was taking phone numbers, people could type out their phone number without using any syntax at all, no dashes, no dots, no spaces. Some people might start off with some parentheses. Some people might just use dots instead of dashes. Some people might use dashes. And when you're trying to sort those phone numbers or look at the length of them, if people aren't putting in the same type of data, that can be a problem. And so some easy things we can do is, one, you can use placeholders, and a placeholder might be something like MM/YYYY for a month and year, right? We could also, show a phone number with the parentheses or something. From there, you probably should do some kind of JavaScript validation, which looks at the actual text that's being typed in and tries to do some sort of validation to make sure that it's clean code. And we can do that using regular expressions. I don't think we're going to get to that in this class, but in future classes, we'll definitely address that. And then last, as the data comes in the server, then you can have some kind of validation to make sure that it's valid data at that point and throw an error if it's not. But this is just, again, a simple way using this password to kind of protect things. And we'll talk about some other ways of validating, content and things like that in upcoming videos.